Good afternoon, everyone, and very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. For those of you that are writing exams this week and have slipped out to join us, thank you. I hope it only adds to your excellence. And to the many other friends of the school, thank you for coming. We're delighted today to have with us the Right Honourable Liam Byrne MP, a quite remarkable MP, only been one for 10 years, had a life before then, doing all sorts of extraordinary things, started his own IT company, really working on e-government, worked for a very large consulting company, Accenture, worked for a very large bank, Rothschilds, and decided that what was really important was politics. And so about 10 years ago, entered into the government, was extremely influential in many aspects of government. Some of us might know what the border police is. That's his creation. We can talk to him about that afterwards. Also, as a Secretary of State in the Home Office, was instrumental in the reorganization of Number 10, worked in a very active way on Alistair Darling's austerity program. We didn't call it austerity then, deficit reduction. And for those of us that have enjoyed the new Birmingham New Street station, as I do occasionally, that's also a result of Liam's engagement to ensure the renewal of it, and we hope you spend a lot of time at Oxford Station and give us a new station soon, because you've done a quite remarkable thing in Birmingham with that. Since being in opposition, he has chaired the Labour Party's policy review, led the shadow Department of Works and Pensions team, and is now the shadow minister for skills, science and higher education, and that obviously is of direct concern to us here. In addition to all of this, he's the author of numerous books, including books on the future of the UK, the road to full employment, reinventing government, and local government transformed. So a thinking politician who is also the governor of the Institute of Government, which is clearly about trying to reform and advance the effectiveness of government. He's also passionate about students and young people, has taken a very active interest in starting various things, including groups which bring together Chinese and UK students. So all sorts of activities across a very wide range of different dimensions of life and the future, and we're absolutely delighted that you've agreed to be here. Speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a question and answer afterwards. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Ian, thank you for that over-generous introduction. And I'm here because, I've been hearing so much about the work of the Oxford Martin School. And the work of Eric Weinhofer in particular has been work that has tremendously influenced me. And I'm someone who passionately believes in the power of ideas in politics. And I guess I'm here because I'm someone who believes that the kind of work that the Oxford Martin School does needs to come much closer to the kind of work that I do in Westminster. And so, I'm here in part to kind of pay tribute, Ian, to what you've done, because you, in a very short space of time, have put yourselves on the map where you have people thinking deeply about the most important questions of the day. But we admire you not just for your search for truth, but for your search for answers. You don't just look for ideas, you do look for solutions. And in politics, what we need right now is an awful lot more solutions. Now, one of the things that you've done in the short time that you've been alive, partly through the fruits of Eric's work and many others, is that you've acquired a leading role in the chorus line calling for change in the years since the economic crash. And I guess what we've learned, especially those of us who are interested in history, that all crises expose flaws in the political economy of the day. And this one was no different. And the argument that I want to make tonight is that if we're serious about answers, as you are at the Oxford Martin School, then we need to recognise that change will only come by actually renewing an alliance that is now a century old. This year, we mark the 100th anniversary of the Great War, in which so many young men and women lost their lives. And the war was not simply an appalling human conflict, it was a crisis that revealed profound weakness in the British economy. And it was a weakness that forced business and government to work together in radical new ways to first win the war and then attempt to win the peace. Now, when Queen Victoria trundled off to the Great Exhibition in 1851, that evening she confided in her diary her belief that as a country we are capable, she wrote, of doing anything. And nearly 50 years later, in 1897, the Diamond Jubilee brought people from across the world to London to celebrate this remarkable occasion. And one of the people who was there watching the great ceremonies and the great processions and the great marches was the young historian Arnold Toynbee. And he later wrote this. He said, "It was, well, here we are, on the top of the world, and we arrived at this peak to stay there forever. Yet, within 2 decades, World War I exposes Britain's comprehensive failure to master the key technologies of the Second Industrial Revolution." And Corelli Barnett, who for some is a controversial historian, but was a very good historian, I think, of Britain's war effort. He wrote this, he said, "British manufacturers were behind other countries in research and in plant and in method. We lacked machine tools, fuses, a coal tar industry, ball bearings, magnetos, aero engines, industrial gauges, and optical glass. We lacked many of the things that you needed in order to prosecute a war on this kind of scale." But of course, before the war, there were many, many people who were making the case for change. From the 1850s, in fact, scientists and engineers were agitating for reform. And it was a network at the other place in Cambridge, rather than at here, of scientists who were pleading for more science on the university curricula. We had parliamentary committees that were formed to undertake inquiries and undertake reviews. The magazine Nature was founded in 1869, and the National Association for the Promotion of Technical Education was founded in 1887. There were then 19 different inquiries into the state of elementary schooling, public schools, secondary schools, universities, scientific instruction, and technical instruction over the course of 15 to 20 years. So the argument that Britain needed to kind of modernise its science and education system was well underway before the First World War. Other people, like that great politician of my home city, Joe Chamberlain, were making the case for a different kind of reform. Joe Chamberlain in 1902 made the very bold statement that the weary Titan, he said, staggers under too vast an orb of its fate, and it was his opening shots in a campaign for the reform of free trade, an argument that was ultimately defeated by the Liberal landslide in 1906. Elsewhere in Britain, the fiscal crisis that followed the South African War, coupled with rising domestic spending, provoked a fundamental reappraisal of Britain's global defence and naval strategy. Acquiescence in the Monroe Doctrine, the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1901, in essence a kind of retreat from both the Western and the Eastern hemisphere. And so what you saw before World War I, with the exception of the gold standard, the basic nostrums of Edwardian political economy, the night watchman state, free trade, splendid isolation, they were all under acute pressure. But it took the crisis of World War I to fuse government and business into a new alliance that would ultimately drive Britain into the modern industrial era where, as the business historian Alfred Chandler said, scope, scale, science and skill were the keys to success. Now, back in 1895, it was a Conservative Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, who was very clear about how he saw the modern business and commercial elite of Britain. He said he detested the new plutocracy of industrial and financial wealth. And thus there was only one man with an industry background, Joe Chamberlain, in the cabinet, and there was only one industrialist, Vickers, on the board of the Bank of England between 1890 and 1914. World War I changed all of that. It inaugurated a very different kind of relationship. It was the moment when Britain realised that business and government had to become partners if the country was to fulfil its promise and not waste its potential. And for the last century, we've been trying to get that relationship right. Now, today's crisis is obviously very different to the crisis of 100 years ago. A century ago, we were debating how business and government could come together to build a different kind of economy. Then we sought to make the second industrial revolution work for Britain. Today, we're trying to make the digital revolution work for Britain's people. Now, since the short, sharp financial crash, the most important fact in British and indeed Western politics are these. It's the wage crash, that long, deep wage crash that has hit economies right the way across the West and provoked this cost of living crisis that is the reality of most people's lives. And what I think is now beginning to happen is a realization is spreading across not just the worlds of politics, but across business, finance, and elsewhere, that we have to rethink how we reconnect wealth creation and social justice. Both the IMF and the OECD have now warned of the risk, the economic risk, of big new inequalities. And that extraordinary speech from Mark Carney underlined that this thinking has now reached the very heart of the Bank of England. Back in February, the IMF said this. They said, "We find that inequality is bad for growth in and of itself. And we can say that redistribution by itself doesn't seem to be bad for growth unless it's very large." Christine Lagarde in London last week said, "Only by making capitalism more inclusive can we make capitalism more effective." Business schools and academics like my old mentor, Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School, are now making the case for shared value. Business leaders like the Blueprint for Better Business group that has been formed by Cardinal Vincent Nichols are arguing for a renewal of trust and much longer term horizons. Around the G20, both the L20 and the B20 are now hammering out a very new kind of agenda for reform. And business finds its echo amongst faith leaders and amongst trade unionists. So both Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Vincent Nichols have called for a revived sense of the common good, a new kind of unity between business and society in purpose. Trade unionists like Francis O'Grady are arguing for the rediscovery of a sense of progressive change. And it's the sort of principle that Chuck Ramuna has been arguing for in his argument for Agenda 2030. And I think that when you boil down what everyone is saying, in a sense, it comes down to this. How do we rebuild an opportunity economy, not just for some, but for all? Now, the bald facts for families in Britain are quite well known. The great wage crash has now destroyed far more family income than the financial crash did. Average earnings now in Britain are about £1,600 a year lower than they were at the last election. The average family has now got to work 2 hours extra a week just to make what they did 4 years ago. What that means is that all the gains that we've seen in productivity and innovation and investment and creativity, they've not gone to the majority of people in our country. They've gone to a small minority of those at the top. And it's not forecast to get any better for a long, long time to come. So at this rate, most households are not going to be back up to their pre-recession living standards until the early 2020s. Now, we can debate why, and you're debating why here at the Oxford Martin School. The economics of superstar earnings in a global economy are now much better understood. Others argue that in a global digital marketplace where entrepreneurs have got the ability to sell at almost zero marginal cost, of course you're going to get big amounts of wealth and assets accruing to a small minority at the top. Thomas Piketty is obviously very famously arguing at the moment that over the long term, the rate of return on assets tends to outstrip the rate of economic growth. But while we can debate the causes, the results are pretty clear. And the results for our country were published by the OECD in an interesting piece of work a couple of weeks ago. They've confirmed that here in Britain, we're one of the very few countries where the majority of wealth is now going to the minority of people. that is an honour that we share with just 3 other Western countries, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Canada. So the bottom 90%, according to the OECD, now enjoy just under half of total income. The majority of wealth, about 55%, is owned by just 10% of people. Now, my argument as a frontline politician serving today is that if we don't fix this, we're not just going to have an economic crisis, we're going to have a moral and political crisis on our hands quite soon. Because the spirit and the habit of hard work are not just fundamental to the economics of our country, they're fundamental to the ethos of our country too. Not for nothing is Rudyard Kipling's If the nation's favourite poet, with its call to fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run. But today, the reality for people is that they feel they're running ever faster on the wheel and simply not getting an inch further in life. A few weeks ago, the Daily Mirror had an extraordinary leader column, and it contrasted 2 stories. The first story was about loan sharks preying on mums at school gates. The second story was about the record number of billionaires who now call Britain home. I've just finished a major inquiry into child poverty in my home city of Birmingham, and the stories are frankly horrific. The head of the National Health Service in our city told us about how we now have record numbers of children in our A&E departments who have tried to take their own lives because of the pressure of poverty at home. We have school secretaries in primary schools ringing up the food bank, Resource Central, saying, look, I've got mums here in floods of tears, they've dropped their kids off with no breakfast, and there's no food in the cupboards for dinner when they get home. We have families in our city that have what they now call scrounge week. It's that last week in the month when there are no treats, there's very little food, and they often have to beg, borrow and steal from neighbours and from friends. We've got households in the inner cities in Birmingham where there are 3 or 4 people who share a bed, with a parent having to sleep on the sofa, children going to school so exhausted because there's no space for peace and quiet at home. Yet most of the parents of these children are in work. And up the road in the City of London, we have corporate bank accounts that are jam-packed with £440 billion of cash. So people in our country are asking, how have we created a society where corporate bank accounts are full and children's stomachs are empty? That's why we confront in Britain not just an economic crisis, but a moral and political crisis too. It's no wonder that people feel that the deal is broken down if the outlook for their children is to go to college, yes, but graduate with £50,000 or £60,000 worth of debt and merely a 50-50 chance of getting a graduate job, and then have to save a record amount to get a deposit for a house, and then have to work longer, and then have to save longer for their retirement. Young people today feel that the deal has broken down. The lack of good jobs means that it is harder than ever to get on and up in life. 80% of the jobs created since the general election have been low income. We're becoming a low pay, low skill, low value added economy, outpaced and outboxed by new powers that are rising around the world, and old nations who, unlike us, get how they need to change. So the argument that people on my side of the House of Commons are making is that we just can't go on like this. We've got to change course. And our challenge is enormous. Our challenge is, how do we rebuild an opportunity economy so that hard work gets you on in life once more? Now, if you're in any doubt about how important this is, just take a casual glance at the future. And this is where we are, I suppose, really in the debt of the Oxford Martin School for the superb Commission on Futures, in which you helped pull together and to lead, and for some of the work that I know Eric's team has undertaken. And we've been very struck by the work of economists like Autor and Dawn in the US that make the point that low-skill, routine jobs are fast becoming the kind of jobs that are under threat. And I think it's, economists here at the Oxford Martin School that have really begun to develop the idea of what that is going to mean in the future. And I think your conclusion was that 47% of jobs in our economy today may well be automated over the years to come. A book that many of us are reading and which many of us love is The Second Machine Age. And the story that it told about the end of routine jobs was very compelling. The idea that there's now enough technology in a Nissan Leaf to render the car a fly-by-wire robot has got profound implications for the future of the transportation industry. The idea that GE can make robots that can climb and repair wind turbines. Future Advisor that uses AI that is strong enough to offer personalized financial advice. Algorithms that take on tasks once performed by paralegals. Oncologists at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Care that use IBM's Watson's computer to provide advice on chronic care and cancer treatment diagnostics. The kind of trend of the future appears obvious to us. We've had the automation of blue-collar jobs. Now we face a future where routine white-collar jobs may be automated too. What does that mean? It means the challenge of building an inclusive economy where people can get on and up in life is becoming harder and harder and harder. So I'm someone, as Ian said, I'm someone who has spent half their life in business, half their life in politics, and so I believe that business and government have got to come together to fix this with an awful lot of help from folk like you. And I guess my argument tonight is that what we need is enlightened self-interest from business and a determination from government to take that enlightened self-interest and do something productive with it. And you know, once upon a time, this was a commonplace in our country. In my home city, it was the Cadbury brothers, George and Richard Cadbury, who helped show the way. And in the years before World War I, it was the founder of Britain's first great multinational, William Lever, who took up the challenge. William Lever at Lever Brothers put in place over the course of 20 or 30 years the 8-hour day, profit sharing, secondary and technical education, pensions, homes, import sunlight, health insurance, and half-pay sickness allowances. And in a wonderful biography, William Lever's son crystallizes his father's business philosophy. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, "The truest and highest form of enlightened self-interest requires that we pay the fullest regard to the interest and welfare of those around us, whose welfare we must bind up with our own, and with whom we must share our prosperity." So, putting inclusive growth at the heart of the opportunity economy, it can't simply be left to business, and it can't simply be delivered by governments. But together, we do stand a fighting chance. So I think that the key task now in Western politics is for policymakers and for profit makers to come together to identify the win-wins that will help us build a future that is genuinely pro-company and pro-worker. And so to get the debate going, what I'm doing tonight for the first time is just proposing a new model. I'm just going to kind of skip forward a little bit because I want to propose a new model of where some of these win-wins might actually lie. Because I think what we've got to do is recognize that building a more inclusive kind of capitalism, building a more inclusive kind of growth is first and foremost going to demand a different kind of, a new level of growth and productivity growth. And so what I wanted to do tonight is just kind of, this is where you sort of recognize that one of my kind of mentors and teachers was Michael Porter, I'm afraid. But what I wanted to do is just sort of set out a number of sort of demand, supply, capital, labour and competition policy implications. But we have got to start. The first win-win is on the demand side. It is on how we build bigger markets for the future. And actually, in this post-Doha world, what policymakers have got to do is narrow in, zero in on what are the 6-lane highways that we can now build between big free trade blocs. So getting a free trade agreement in place between the EU and the United States is something that could have a profound and positive impact on growth here in Europe. Getting in place the new EU-China investment agreement could have huge upside. The US helping lead TPP and getting that in place could have huge upside for the global economy. We think that an EU-US free trade agreement could add £4 to £10 billion a year in growth to our economy. The EU-China investment agreement could add getting on for £2 billion a year in growth to the UK economy. And here in Europe, it's just not realistic for us to ask surplus companies like Germany to suppress domestic demand when what they need to be doing is driving forward reform of their services industry so that actually we can begin completing the single market here in Europe. That is the kind of thing, that is the kind of reform that British politicians like Douglas Alexander intend to drive for. So, along with that, we've got to build not just trade policy, but trade-enhancing infrastructure. Here in the UK, as many of you know, our infrastructure lags well behind the rest of the OECD. I think we're now ranked 28th in the world by the World Economic Forum on our quality of infrastructure. Congestion on our roads, that's going to add £10 billion of cost this year. Our rail network, it's overcrowded, particularly, I might say, between Oxford and Birmingham. Port capacity forecast to be outstripped by demand pretty soon. You only have to attempt to fly in or out of Heathrow Airport to understand the need for new airports in our country. So, look, there's a series of demand-side reforms, both on free trade deals and trade-enhancing infrastructure, that is a big win-win that is there for the taking between business and government. The second win-win, though, is on the supply side. And here, my call is for much more concerted efforts to boost the level of science and research and innovation that is available, publicly backed for business growth. In truth, I believe innovation is the only way out of austerity. The best way to raise real wages in Britain, quite frankly, is to build a bigger knowledge economy. The knowledge economy in Britain today, it's about a third of GDP, it's a third of businesses, it's only 19% of jobs. If it were a third of jobs, there would be 2.4 million extra jobs in the knowledge economy in Britain. What are they worth? Well, on average, they're worth £161 a week, more than the pay packets in the rest of the economy. That is a 40% pay rise. And I guarantee if I put a 40% pay rise on the table in front of you tonight, if you weren't a member of Parliament, you'd be forced to take it. Now, you can't just simply legislate to raise levels of science and innovation in an economy, but you can set as a lodestar for business and government work together the ideal of a bigger knowledge economy. I think that is very good for the higher education sector. It's very good for the skills system too. There's a win-win there that we've got to work out together. The third win-win on the right-hand side of the chart there is patient capital. Reform of financial markets is now widely regarded as critical to the creation of inclusive growth, because on the one hand, the thirst for short-term profits, it drives dysfunctional corporate behaviour, it damages growth and jobs in the long term, and limits the supply of capital that is available for long-term needs like infrastructure and innovation. Now, PricewaterhouseCoopers recently forecast that globally, assets under management are going to rise by 2020 to about $102 trillion US. That is an awful lot of money. And yet, as Michael Lewis's recent book, Flash Boys, makes clear, predatory behaviour is alive and well in financial markets. So the question is, how do we change investor behaviour? Well, I think Dominic Barton and Mark Wiseman got it right when they wrote in the Harvard Business Review a month or two ago that it's now very clear that the shadow of short-termism has continued to advance. They surveyed 1,000 board members, and what they found is that 2/3 report that pressure to generate short-term results has actually gone up over the last 5 years. They said 4 out of 5 executives that they surveyed felt especially pressured to demonstrate strong financial performance over just a 2-year period. And so they conclude that if we're to change this, we've got to find a way of bringing asset owners and asset managers into the conversations. There's a range of changes, a range of choices that perhaps are available to us, defining long-term strategy, allocating more assets to illiquid investments like infrastructure and housing, taking a bigger role in companies when things begin to go wrong, and beginning to measure the kinds of metrics that are actually good for long-term economic growth. Do you pay your taxes? Do you turn over your employees, every couple of years? Are you a responsible and green corporate citizen? Now, there are some And I believe that there are investment companies like BlackRock and Hermes that are beginning to debate this, who are now beginning to think through how do they create these kind of ethical investment frameworks, these ethical indexes that allow us to see more accurately a way of directing patient capital into businesses which are good. Now, Greg McClymont, who is a brilliant colleague, was a great teacher here at Oxford, is our shadow pension spokesman. He is making the case that actually we're not going to make these changes unless we change the way that we manage and organise pension funds, unless we change the role of the trustee in pension funds, and unless we change fiduciary duties on some of those pension fund trustees too. And I happen to think he's right. We've got to bring the debate about pension fund governance into this debate. My fourth win-win then is labour. The win-win has got to be how do we create more productive workers, and how do we restore a very, very simple deal. If workers do more to improve corporate profitability, then yes, they need to get a pay rise. Now, work is key to inclusive growth because traditionally in our economy, wages have only tended to rise when the labour market happens to be quite tight. But we've got to raise levels of productivity because that is the best way in which, in the long term, we're going to raise levels of wages. Now, it would seem that the goal of full employment, happily, has now got cross-party support. Well, we'll see. But there is also now a widespread view amongst policymakers and amongst profit makers that a much bigger, much better vocational education system is critical to our country. Now, here in the UK, we don't do enough to stop people drifting away from the labour market. It's why we, amongst a number of other European politicians, have said you've got to put some backstops into the labour market. You need job guarantees to stop people drifting away too far from the labour market. But we've got to do more than that. If you look across the OECD, you've now got companies that are already far ahead of us in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, in Germany, further abroad in countries like South Korea, which are undertaking radical reform of their vocational systems. Why? Because they want to create a vocational route, not just to skills, but to higher level skills. And so when we publish more policy work on Labour's policy for higher education, which we'll do over the course of the summer, what you will see there is our attempt to put the creation of a vocational route to higher level skills, an earn while you learn revolution, at the absolute centre of our skills reforms. We think that makes it much easier to have a richer debate with business about how you raise the living wage. Right the way around the world now, you're beginning to see this debate about minimum wages really begin to take off. And it's partly because across the OECD, minimum wage increases have been pretty flat over the last 4 or 5 years. But I'm not saying everyone will bring forward votes like the one that was defeated in Switzerland for what, a $15 an hour or £15 an hour minimum wage proposal. But look, in Seattle, they voted through a minimum wage that is twice the federal minimum wage. The German Bundestag, I think, is going to vote on a minimum wage in Germany for the first time. In Britain, Ed Miliband's leading the charge to campaign for a living wage. In my home city, Labour has just been re-elected on a ticket of driving the living wage right the way through the Birmingham economy, right the way across the Western world. You're beginning to see pressure on minimum wages begin to ratchet up. And so if business wants to get around the table and talk about the win-win, business is going to, I think, ask for a different kind of deal on skills. And what we're hearing is people say it's the vocational skills system, it's the higher skills that are really missing. But there is a win-win to be had here around more productive workers and better paid workers. The fifth win-win for me is then just about the competitive intensity of markets. And this is obviously sometimes a controversial issue because many of the markets involved are often highly regulated. There might be natural monopolies like energy companies or transport systems, or in some countries, banks. But here, the win-win that I think we've got to shoot for with business is really about this question. How do we increase the competitive intensity of those particular markets? The reason it's important is that good competition, strong competition is good for prices. But look, the creation of new market entrants, often high-performing companies, is great for jobs. A few years ago, Nesta published a brilliant piece of work that made the argument that just 6% of new businesses create up to half of net new jobs. Now in Britain, the real figure may be closer to 30%, but high-performing new startup market challengers are great for jobs, they're great for competition, and they're great for prices. So reframing this argument about competitive intensity is something that I think policymakers and profit makers can really do. There's two just sort of further issues which I just wanted to kind of touch on very quickly because why they may not be kind of as core as many of these arguments, they are nonetheless very, very important. And I just want to skip forward to a couple of slides to help me illustrate this point. Inclusive growth, an inclusive model of capitalism, means that no place is left behind. And Britain is not unusual to many other countries. This is a piece of work from the OECD not long ago, and basically what it shows is that in those dark blue areas, those are the parts of our country that are trapped in low skill and therefore low pay equilibria. You've got a persistent low demand for skills and a persistent low supply of skills. And so if we're to kind of put regional policy on a different kind of footing, then this is the win-win that we should be talking about. How do we increase investment in science and innovation so that the knowledge economies in those parts of the country are bigger? And how do we direct investment, target investment in skill systems in those parts of the country to try and basically move them on to a different equilibrium where demand for higher skills is bigger and supply of better skills is better too. The final win-win, and this will be one of the more contentious areas, I think, for many people in the business community, is on the issue of tax. If we want bigger investment in science and in innovation, if we want more investment in high-quality education systems and skill systems, then frankly, the money is going to have to come from somewhere. And people not paying their fair tax is actually inequitable, not just for business and for people, but in and amongst the business community as well. I was teaching a class of chief executives at Templeton College on Tuesday morning, and this was the debate that really got people going. And of course, many people in the audience, as you would expect, said, well, you know, you've got it all wrong. Actually, you just need to cut taxes, cut regulation, and get out the way. But then different voices came into the debate. The idea that actually, if business behaves like this, that is not sustainable. You're going to get a political reaction. That is bad for political risk management. So we've got to find a way of business and policymakers coming together to actually talk, not just about what are the right levels of tax, but how do we make sure that people pay those taxes as well. So that is a very quick, rough and ready canter through what is a very different kind of debate that I think we need to have, not over the next few months, not over the next few years, but probably over the next decade. Many people in the business community, as well as in politics, will find this difficult. I guess the conclusion that I've reached, having thought about this question for the last 4 or 5 years, is that we have got to reframe this debate, not as a zero-sum game between business and government, but as a series of win-wins. Writing in 1926, John Maynard Keynes concluded in The End of Laissez-Faire this. He said, "Devotees of capitalism are often unduly conservative and reject reforms in its technique, which might really strengthen and preserve it, for fear that they may prove to be the first steps away from capitalism itself." Well, a century ago, government and business came together to win the war. And for all the mistakes that they made, a very different kind of economy was born during the course of the 1920s and the 1930s. It was a very different partnership that emerged between business and government. And it wasn't strong enough to defeat old prejudices like protectionism or old ideas like the gold standard. That took that hard work of policymakers during the course of Bretton Woods. But today, the debate about a new economy, a more inclusive capitalism, where work once again commands its just reward, now has the potential to unite us and not just to divide us. It's time that we got round the table to talk. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, thank you so much, Liam, for very wide-ranging historical, analytic, economic and societal discussion on inclusive capitalism. And it's wonderful to see this combination of passion and drawing on so much literature. And thank you for your kind words on the Oxford Martin School too, and the work of INET. We open for questions and answers. I do see quite a few people from senior positions in the university administration, division heads, former head of Universities UK, is that what it was called? And Master of Balliol College, who might have some questions about what you think about higher education and universities too in all of this. So I presume you'd be happy to take those questions too, given your portfolio. Do go ahead. Say who you are. There's Clara with a microphone at the back. Okay, quite a few hands. Why don't we? This is Carl Frey, by the way, who wrote the paper that says 47% of jobs are going to be lost.
Thanks for cheering us all up, Carl. Thanks.
So I have a question, and so in a recent study, Larry Katz and Claudia Goldin found that while serving Harvard graduates, that about 5% of Harvard graduates went into banking and consulting back in the 1970s, and today that figure is about 40%. And I'm not sure exactly what the figure for Oxford and Cambridge is, but it seems to me that this is a huge misallocation of talent, and it's also I do believe that financial services and consulting are doing some important work, but it seems also to me that that's a big driver of actually what's happening with inequality. So I was wondering if you have any ideas on how to deal with that.
Yeah, interesting. So as a former banker, I guess I have to agree with your kind words, although they sounded like they were in parenthesis, that many bankers do good work. And actually, that is true. Many of folks working in the finance community are doing fantastic work, but the incentives within which they work are terrible. And I think, Dominic has done us all a sort of tremendous service, actually, by just enlarging the debate about patient capital in a really kind of productive way. And I do think that of the sort of win-wins that I mentioned tonight, the question around patient capital is probably the hardest, but the insight that you've got to get the asset owners and the asset managers into the conversation is incredibly important. Now, Greg McClymont, who I mentioned, when he started in his role as Shadow Pensions Minister, used to tell me a joke that apparently comes from the 1920s about the newcomer coming along to the harbour in New York, and someone pointing to all the huge yachts in the harbour and saying to them, look at all those extraordinary yachts. Those are the yachts of these great barons of Wall Street. And obviously the guest who had come up from rural America said, well, where are their customers' yachts? And this question of how you get asset owners and asset managers, how you re-regulate, I guess, the sort of financial intermediaries is absolutely one of the thorniest questions. Now, I think Dominic Barton's article in Harvard Business Review earlier this year was good. It was a bit optimistic about just, encouraging people to take a more longer-term approach and giving them tools to take that longer-term approach. I'm just not convinced that is going to do the job on its own, and that's why I guess I've become convinced that changing the way that trustees work in pension funds, changing the definition of fiduciary duties is probably some of our better bets. When you look at the kind of Cadbury takeover in Birmingham, I think it would have been illegal for some of the trustees on the Cadbury pension fund who owned a big chunk of Cadbury shares to actually vote against the takeover of their own company. Now that's a perversity which may be okay if we explore it, but it definitely demands some exploring. So that's my kind of defense of bankers and sort of finance managers. They're kind of good people. They're good people in bad systems, I guess you would summarize it as. But look, I think more, this I think is actually more to your question. I do think that higher education has to change quite fundamentally over the next 10 to 20 years, because at the moment, certainly in our country, we don't have this vocational route up through higher level skills, and yet that is the choice that young people want. If you go to meet a group of young people on their first day at Rolls-Royce, for example, and you say, why are you here in Rolls-Royce? They say, because these people will pay for my degree. In 4 years' time, I'll have a B.Eng, I will be debt-free, and I'll have 4 years work experience. I'll have the foundations of a good life. At the moment, in British higher education, I'm afraid to say, and I'm deliberately going to provoke some of you now, I don't think we've had enough innovation in the formats of higher education study. And therefore, we're asking ourselves in the Labour Party, how do we incentivise a wider diversity of formats for study up to a higher level? How do we maximise the involvement of business in the design and delivery of curricula? Now, I don't think the answer is more and more marketisation of higher education, because I think if we're to change higher education structurally over the next 5 or 10 years, you've got to find ways of putting in place long-term investment agreements with universities and university leaders. I don't think marketisation is going to deliver us that. So I guess finance people, good people in bad systems, how do we change the system? Big question. How do we change the incentives on people coming up through higher education? Well, one of the ways surely that we've got to do that is create a very different kind of vocational system over the years to come.
Thanks, Francis. I should have said that this is being
Sorry, that was
webcast
too long.
and recorded, so if you don't want to be webcast and recorded, don't ask a question. The gentleman on your left there.
You should declare an interest first.
I'll declare an interest, Liam. You and I used to work together. What I'm interested in, by coincidence, I was at a talk that Ian gave earlier on in the week about global governance and the lack of international engagement to manage and control certain areas. What I wanted to ask you about was how a national government can effectively relate to big international businesses, which, from my experience of dealing with them on the subject of innovation, tend to see sources of innovation on a geographical and an economic basis and interest basis for them. And I was just wondering, in the light of the recent EU elections, whether what you're talking about needs to be addressed by a sort of a wider alliance of governments, rather than just being something that's driven in a solely UK-centric context.
Yeah. So this is a wonderful question, and Ian and I used to work together trying to encourage governments and public authorities to become more innovative, with greater and lesser successes, I think it's fair to say. But absolutely right, and the future has got to be in the way that we organise global networks in a completely new way. And national governments are becoming less and less relevant to how you deliver that. In a sense, what is happening now is a kind of double shift. Global arrangements are becoming more important, and local and regional arrangements are becoming more important. Now, I owe this fact to Peter Nolan, who's a wonderful professor of Chinese development at Cambridge, who tells me that 1,400 companies now control half of global R&D, so it's about $700 billion. And if we are to organise innovation systems more effectively, if we're to kind of boost the supply side provision of research and development, we've got to think about how we organise those global networks in more effective ways. Now, one of the ways that we can do that is campaign for bigger Horizon 2020 funding, because Horizon 2020 funding from the EU is absolutely critical to the research base of universities like Oxford now. You'll forgive me for then adding, we have also then got to stay in the European Union in order to be able to get our hands on some of that cash. But driving through a reform agenda for the new commissioners that results in a bigger Horizon 2020 programme, that's the kind of reform programme that we should be promoting in Europe. But second, we should be helping our universities build global networks of shared science and knowledge platforms in a completely new kind of way. Because what we see are big companies, those 1,400 companies, they're now shifting, basically, their innovation model. They're moving from the cathedral to the campus. So once upon a time, they put a load of clever people in a big building and prayed for the best. Now what they're doing is they're building complex ecosystems of smaller businesses and international partners on business parks. So if you look at GSK at Stevenage, or if you look at BT at Astral Park, once upon a time, they were big shrines to big science. Now, they're complicated ecosystems of much, much smaller businesses, but they're built around shared science and knowledge platforms. Now, what we've got the chance to do, because British higher education is so incredibly brilliant, is become the kind of central hubs for many of those international networks. But those hubs will be connected to other shared science platforms around the world. So if you look at what Southampton University is doing with the government of Singapore in marine science, building big shared platforms. If you look at what Birmingham University is doing in life science with Guangzhou, shared platforms. You know, you can come up with examples after examples after examples. If you take the Hadron Collider, much of the data for that actually processed, you know, here in Britain. If you take the Gaia billion star observer, much of the science developed here in Britain. But those are shared global projects because the problems that they're tackling are too big for any one company or any one country to tackle alone. And so thinking through how we build these international networks, that is where I think the future is. Now that's got implications for policy. You can't get that right if you've got a ridiculous immigration policy like this current government has. If you come out of international organisations like the European Union, that job is going to become much harder. We've got to embrace the world, but in our terms, because actually we've got a tremendous amount to gain from these new networks. But it's going to take new networks of leaders in order to drive that kind of agenda forward.
The person immediately.
Yeah, thanks. It's a follow-up on the previous point, really, a query about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the Free Trade Agreement. Just a bit wary of putting all our eggs in the free trade basket as the only channel for economic growth. We've seen in other trade agreement areas, for example, tobacco companies suing the Australian government for putting plain packaging on cigarettes. So how can the next government reassure itself that in promoting progressive social policies in the health sector or the transport sector, you know, it's not a heads you lose, tails you lose economy, that we're still not paying out for these global companies to actually compensate them for actually pursuing some progressive social policy?
Yeah, you're right to sound notes of caution, and I think, you know, you're beginning to see both in the Senate and in the European Parliament, you know, you're definitely beginning to see a better articulation of the caveats, like, for example, minimum labour standards that need to be factored into some of these agreements. I suppose my point is that if you look at the next sort of 4 or 5 years, the scope for fiscal policy to add much to global growth is very, very limited. We've now got the risk of very disorganised exit from monetary policy as the Fed and the ECB begin to end up in different places. So monetary policy is not going to give us much either, I don't think. If you look at the prospects for global consumption, you've got very high levels of unemployment, especially in the EU. You've got real pressure on real wages. Therefore, there's going to be no great fillip to growth from consumption. If you then look at investment, you've still got private balance sheets across the EU and indeed the US in quite bad shape. You've got big fragmentation of lending rates to SMEs, and so there's no real prospect of investment-led growth either. Well, where does that leave you? It leaves you in net exports. But right now, if you add up everybody's forecast for net export growth, you quickly conclude that we're going to have to start exporting to the moon pretty damn quickly because there just isn't the demand to soak up all those export forecasts. And so unless free trade reform is driven further and faster, then I'm just, you know, I'm worried about where the real systemic sources of growth are going to come from. But I don't detract from a moment from your point that a more mature and a more sophisticated and a wider social set of demands need to be factored into some of those agreements. I think that point is very well made.
Okay, the woman over there.
Rain Newton-Smith, Oxford Economics. I was very much taken with your comments about the importance of infrastructure to try and boost Britain's demand and productivity over the long term. You know, and I was wondering what you saw of the role of businesses and public policy and even, you know, the sort of academic environment in trying to shift the focus onto the long-term benefits from investment in things like airports and transport infrastructure, when I think, you know, everyone's sort of natural tendency is to really focus on the short-term costs.
Yeah. So Andrew Adonis has this phrase that, you know, everybody wants high-speed rail, but no one wants the railway line. You know, and you know, and do you know what? That's always been a dilemma. I mean, that was a problem back in the 1840s and the 1850s. In fact, the railway line, this is such a funny story, the railway line into Birmingham takes a funny bend to the east of the city. And the reason it takes that funny bend is that at the time, James Watt's son or grandson owned the great estate of Aston Hall and said, there's no way that this railway line is coming through my land, thanks very much. So, you know, this has always been a kind of problem. But actually, I think what's fascinating about high speed 2 is that business has been a really important creator of a positive environment for that infrastructure to take place. And, you know, but at times I've often felt that the political capital for that infrastructure project was draining away in quite a dangerous way. And it's been at those moments that the business voice has actually been really well articulated. And so the consistency of business support for this kind of infrastructure, I think it's been really kind of positive and important. Now, we can ask ourselves why it's not had the same effect when it comes to Heathrow Airport and port capacity and, you know, key rail links like the road links like the A14 out to Tilbury. But I think business is getting much better organised and is getting much better focused on delivering the argument for those long-term benefits and frankly giving politicians a lot more spine. Now, what we all agree with is the need for a much longer-term approach, easier said than done. John Arnott has done a great piece of work for the Labour Party and is actually working now on a kind of draft infrastructure bill that we hope will give us some of the legislative framework for delivering this. But actually, I think the infrastructure debate has been a really good one, and I think it's an example of how business and government has come together in a win-win kind of way. We need to kind of replicate that approach now in demand, you know, in free trade, in science and innovation, and in skills policy, I would say.
Alex? Alex is the division head for maths, physical, and life sciences here.
Thanks.
Don't be worried. So I just wanted to quickly ask about the role of the interface between government and universities in terms of developing a science and technology innovation strategy for the UK. Different countries have tackled this very, very differently, both in terms of the level of scientific advice that goes into the highest levels of government in places like America, etc., versus France, say. And but also some countries have invested quite heavily in building a strategic side to their science and technology infrastructure. Germany in particular, where they've built in Fraunhofer type structures that actually particularly develop science and engineering that is of relevance to business and industry. And it's a government supported thing. The UK has sort of dabbled in this, but it sort of basically recognises that its universities are where most of the science happens, and they've actually developed a funding system for those universities that is intensely competitive, and actually, if anything, generates fragmentation rather than strategic thinking. And I'm wondering whether you've got any thoughts about whether we've got that wrong, maybe, and if we need to...
Can you just draw out the point about the funding system as a thing that fractures?
Well, the REF, for example, the Research Excellence Framework, is intensely competitive. There are some universities that are working together regionally now in a new way, which is very encouraging. But the idea of in Cambridge, you know, Oxford, Imperial College, and UCL all putting in a joint submission for their research excellence to HEFCE to get funding for what they want to do together, just, you know, that's a pipe dream right now. Nobody's ever really done that. So I'm just wondering whether...
size around this bit of the room when you said that.
So I'm just wondering whether there is something missing in terms of the way we're doing things. At the moment, we're encouraging universities to be quite competitive and entrepreneurial and develop their own thing, both in terms of the amount of money we're putting to universities rather than into government laboratories, say, many of which we've closed down, but also in terms of you know, the degree to which the universities are really involved in developing any kind of strategic thinking for the UK. A good example of where I'm wrong is in biosciences, where I think the UK has come up with some big strategic thinking about what it wants to do in terms of life sciences and what it'll do for the economy. A good example of where I'm right, I think, is energy, where in terms of energy research and energy policy, we're all over the place, you know, and the universities haven't been able to help very much.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've not opined much on the future of the ref, although we're going to publish a science green paper in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, and this is one of the questions we're going to kind of ask people's views on. So I've thought more about 2 related questions, and it was a subject of some of our discussions here this afternoon at the Oxford Martin School. So one is this kind of gap between pure science funding and TSB funding, where the policy space is quite messy, it's not linear, and it's not clear that there is either funding in that space, nor necessarily the right governance arrangements to direct funding in that space. And other countries like the US have, in their past, done a better job at answering these questions. So one of the things we're very keen to hear views on is, are there significant gaps that help us connect science and commercialization or policy application, and crucially, what are the right governance mechanisms for distributing that money? Because it isn't obvious that an RC UK-like structure is the right kind of structure for that. The second thing, though, that troubles me a lot, my brother was a civil servant, and he used to say, he was a Treasury civil servant, and he used to say, the bane of his life was policy-based evidence making. This kind of problem that bedeviled poor civil servants, where they had to sort of go out and find evidence to support the policy of the moment proposed by a particular kind of minister. And my observation as a minister who has worked on some of the biggest problems that we've had in government is that I think the pipeline of scientific advice into government is actually very poor. And I think the advent of scientific advisors has made a huge difference. But one has to ask, is a chief scientific advisor the right structure for a department? Would it not make more sense if there was a council of scientific advisors? Is it fair to ask a CSA for a particular government department to know everything about anything in that particular department? Do we actually need to institute science councils for departments in a different kind of way? That would lend capacity to the feed of scientific advice into central government, but it would also lend, I think, a breadth of relationships that would be very valuable. Of course, the one department that doesn't have an independent scientific advisor is the most important department of all, which is Her Majesty's Treasury, where, in fact, there is a premium that's higher than anywhere else on understanding what works and what doesn't. And very often it is a kind of poor grade 5 or poor grade 7 in a Treasury spending team that does have to opine on what kind of policy solution works and what kind of policy solution doesn't. And I think, to his huge credit, David Willetts has done a great job at kind of institutionalising the sort of what works network. That was something that I was very interested in when I was at the Cabinet Office. David's done a great job getting that kind of up and running. But it's not rich enough in scientific advice at the moment, or the disciplines of evaluation. And crucially, there's no real conduit for that kind of thinking into Her Majesty's Treasury. And so, we have to think about how we radically strengthen the role of social science in government policy making, and how we pipe much more effectively. How do we build broadband for scientific advice into number 10 Downing Street in the Treasury? Because, right now they're on line speeds that are very slow and very old. It's an honest.
Cameron?
Cameron Hepburn from INET at the Oxford Martin School. Liam, thanks for such a wide-ranging talk. I want to really just make a simple request of you, actually. It relates to short-termism. I think you'd agree that one of the important things here is focusing on the stocks rather than the flows or even the rate of change of flows. So the stock of wealth and our capital and our physical capital, our human and social capital. And you probably also agree that kind of the state of country balance sheets is terrible, certainly compared to corporate balance sheets, and getting wealth accounts is important. And you addressed it a little bit in the start of your talk, but on slide 2, this is my request. Like many, you referred to wealth as not just income, but the rate of change of income. And they're quite important different things. And it's that sort of that confusion between flows and changes in the rates of flows, which is a very short-term thing, with the thing that matters, which is the stock, which is wealth, is really quite important. So my request is just to amend your slide 2.
Yes,
Thank you.
You are at a university.
Well, ask you to
Thank you very much. I'm the visiting European Union Fellow here at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. And I wanted to ask, you mentioned a little bit about pension fund governance, but I wanted to ask about funding for innovation. And in financial markets regulation, since the crisis, we've seen a prioritization for legitimate reasons of stability, prevention of fraud, ending regulatory arbitrage. But how can we mobilize the patient capital that you mentioned, more for SMEs, for other industry interested in innovation, in effect, opening up the innovation landscape rather than closing it down in the financial market regulation change that we are going to be approaching potentially under your government?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the models that has really kind of caught our eye is a model that we've looked at a lot in Israel. And so what is interesting about the Israeli model, which has basically got the Office of the Chief Scientist, Avi Hassan, who spends about $500 million a year, in a very small country, co-investing in new startup businesses. But he has co-investment partners that will often be quite localized venture and incubator kind of finance, like Jerusalem Venture Partners or Rad Biomed in Tel Aviv. But it's a very stable, long-term and co-investment model. And what we don't have in our country, we have the Technology Strategy Board, although it's making grant investments rather than equity investments. What we don't have is that ecology of more local finance houses. You've got it a bit in Cambridge, you've got it a bit in London. It's quite limited outside. And so we have policy on regional banks. We've said that we should move towards regional banks. We've got an awful lot of work to do to turn those ideas into reality. One of the things that we kind of need to look at is how do you actually foster better, I don't want to say regional venture funds because I don't mean regions in the traditional sense. I mean venture funds that work in and around particular clusters. So that's kind of one argument. The second observation, though, is we spent a lot of time with Cambridge Enterprise and some of the entrepreneurs that they've spun out. And basically what they say is, look, there's no shortage of angel finance in Cambridge. There's lots of angel finance. But by the time you get to, say, the third round or fourth round, the finance syndicates are led by Americans. And then the pressure becomes to lift and shift the business back to parts of the US. And the offer that is made is not simply to put in American equity money, but to put in very old-fashioned money called sales. And that is through the SBRI program run through NIH or the Department of Defense, which is able to basically pump up small businesses very, very quickly and very, very effectively. And obviously for the entrepreneur, sales don't dilute, therefore that's a pretty attractive kind of model. The SBRI program in Britain is hopeless. In fact, I've put down parliamentary questions to both George Osborne and Vince Cable recently to say, okay, how much money is going through SBRI to British businesses? And they basically don't know. So if you can't evaluate and monitor something, then all my experience as a minister tells me that you haven't really got a proper grip on it. Now, given that Her Majesty's government spends £256 billion a year, we're simply not using procurement power in a way that we could to support smaller businesses. And in the areas of defence and in the Department of Health, that is a really, really important area. I mean, I was sort of happy that there was the comment that we've got policy in the life science space in a better shape than perhaps we have in other areas. I'm actually more worried about life science because I think that we don't have a regulatory regime that is necessarily right for a world of targeted and personalised medicine, which is coming. I think there remain quite big problems about early access of new drugs to the NHS. There definitely remains problems around availability of data around results. And this is a really interesting area where you have a huge procurement budget that is run by a state authority. You have a hugely important industry, But sometimes we don't necessarily maximise the potential to use that procurement pound to strengthen the industries and the businesses that we want to foster.
Great. Jump with the pink shirt.
Thank you for your speech. I'm simply an AS level economics student, so forgive me for my probable lack of knowledge. But inequality in Victorian Britain in the 60s was very high, but the government focused on investment such as the Suez Canal in 75, which led to increased welfare in the 80s and 90s. Would it ever be acceptable in the current economy to accept an inequality gap, not very large, or such as those of the mints, as the opportunity cost for investment, long-term growth, and a reduced inequality gap in the future?
Great question. So there is always going to be that inequality gap in both income and in assets. And I think, what was fascinating about that particular period of political economy that you reference is, you did indeed begin to see Britain, major on the traditional staple industries of the first industrial revolution, but take a very active role in basically building global infrastructure in a way that enhanced trade in those markets to which we had ready access, and obviously communications around steam and telegraph and rail systems helped enormously to that. And if you look at the great entrepreneurs of that period, whether it was the Cadburys or whether it was the Lever brothers, they moved very, very aggressively to exploit those new markets that were, so interconnected by this new infrastructure within, what was a sort of reasonably free trade environment at a time when tariff wars were going up in continental Europe and in the United States. So actually, that period of history was a good example of how we maintained a level of growth through trade-enhancing policy internationally. So I'm not sure necessarily that inequality was a major part of that, of the dynamism, if you like, of that political economy. In fact, it was a period when real wages were rising quite quickly, which is why people bought soap and chocolate in sort of unprecedented quantities. But so I guess I would sort of step away from an argument that said inequality should be used as a kind of policy device in order to drive growth either in the short, medium, or long term, because I think actually our problem right now is that we have too much inequality, and actually reducing it is what is going to be needed to put growth back on a more sustainable basis.
Thank you. Just one over here, and then Eric, and then I.
In Germany, each year, the university graduates, the percentage is about 19%. In the non-competitive parts in Europe, in Italy, in Spain, and in Greece, the percentage is much, much higher.
Percentage of what, sorry?
Of university graduates, of people with
yeah.
So how come, is there a problem of studying the wrong stuff, or do we have too many leaders and not enough followers who who are supposed to implement what the leaders tell them?
Well, no, I mean, I think we do need we do need big numbers of university graduates. I mean, I think we're still behind the United States slightly in our graduation rates. We're a long way behind economies like Australia, although we can debate the virtues of the Australian higher education system. Where I think we are really falling behind is in vocational levels of vocational training at high levels of skill. So technician and professional levels of skill. That's where the biggest skills gaps are really forecast. So in my home city of Birmingham, I serve the community with the highest youth unemployment in the country. My constituency is on literally the other side of a motorway, the other side of the M6, to Jaguar Land Rover, which is poaching, I shouldn't say poaching, which is hoovering up the highly qualified technical talent in our city. And lots of sort of small and medium-sized businesses are being sort of frustrated by what's going on. And why is it? It's because there's a huge skills gap at kind of level 4 to level 6, at that sort of technician and higher levels of technical skills. So I'm all for getting at least 50% of young people through a university system. What I want is the other 50% to have an equal chance to train to higher levels of skill as well. And those are the reforms that I see in our competitor countries like Holland and South Korea, and I fear that we're falling behind them.
Eric Beinhacker at Oxford. Firstly, thank you for a truly inspiring talk. And one can only hope if the debate in the upcoming election is even a tenth as substantive, we'd all be very pleased. You mentioned the challenge of patient capital, and you mentioned the need for pension reform, fiduciary reform. My question is about the other side of the coin, corporate governance reform.
Yeah.
If you ask many of the CEOs who were at the Inclusive Capital meeting, they would say they would like to invest longer term. They would like to have a different settlement with their employees. They are concerned about these issues of inclusive capitalism, but they're very shackled by the constraints and incentives of the system that they're in. And it has real macro consequences. We've seen investment plummet to actually record low levels, even while corporate profits are very high, and a host of other consequences. Any thoughts on, do we need a fresh conversation about how corporations are run?
Yeah, you'll know better than me, but I think rising levels of profitability are basically resulting in higher levels of cash balances as well. I mean, share buybacks. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah, share buybacks are starting, but you haven't seen this massive movements of this cash back to shareholders, I don't think. I mean, a lot of it is just kind of sitting at 0.5%. Dead money, as Keynes used to call it. And so, do you need a debate about corporate governance? Well, what I've tried to deliberately do, I suppose, is pick the areas where I think the win-wins might be more fruitful and more short-term. And corporate governance is an issue not just in terms of the governance of the companies, arrangements around remuneration, policies on supply chain and the way that suppliers are treated, particularly in emerging markets. I do think that's a factor, but I'm worried about how fruitful that is going to be in the short term. Whereas I think that both business leaders and politicians alike share a concern about the impatience of asset owners and asset managers. And so, although the subject might feel thornier, my hunch is that we're going to have a more fruitful conversation between business and government around reform to the financial managers than we are around corporate governance. But that is not to delete reform of corporate governance from the to-do list.
Great. Thank you so much, Liam, for being with us, for sharing your thoughts, which have been extremely wide-ranging and included some optimistic news as to the importance of universities and also very kind words on the Oxford Martin School and the Commission. But I think we've all been inspired, and I've learnt a lot, and I know a bit about the subject, so that's been really tremendous. Now, this is coming towards the end of Trinity term, so I just want to invite you all to the 4 remaining forthcoming events here. On the 11th of June at 12:15, we have a lunchtime talk by Professor Mark Kane, who's the Professor of Earth and Climate at Columbia University, called on climate variability and human conflict, so the link between climate and conflict. The same day at 5 o'clock on the 11th of June, we have Professor Ray Kozlowski, who is from the University of Albany, on the American way of border control and immigration reform politics. So that could be a very interesting conversation from your past. The 12th of June, the next day, Joseph Reeves, who is going to be finalizing our seminar series on citizen science, and this is on humanitarian engagement and how humanitarian citizen science works for crisis response. And then finally, our last event of this academic year, on the 19th of June at 5:30, Professor Lavanya Rajamani on understanding the battle lines and negotiations for the 2015 climate agreement. So big focus on climate and on other issues, and you're very welcome to come to those. Further details on our website, of course, of everything going on at the Oxford Martin School. Thanks so much to you, Liam.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Really perfect.
Really appreciate it. Yeah, really appreciate the chance in the audience. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Good to see you as well. That was great. And of course, I agree with it all as well, which is